Hello everyone, today we talk about the persistence of white sects of paganism in Rome after the rise of Christianity to official religion of the empire. And already like that, especially if you have been following my content from some time, you know that there is a setting, even in the separation between paganism and especially the concept of paganism and its opposition, let's say, to Christianity that does not work on many levels of the history of religions. There was no such thing like paganism. One can even go as far as saying that there was no such thing, or let's say an innovative thing like Christianity per se, but that there was a unique, universal religion that every single people shared. And that, I really mean it, properly didn't differ from yours. We like to label, say, Christianity as, Semitic religion. There are, as a conservative, I hear many times, this idea that, of course, from one side there is a lot of Christian conservatism, and from the other there is this kind of fourth estate or ethno-nationalism and said, oh no, it was not, a true European religion. The paganism was a true Indo-European creed, and it was all. This is a very, let's say, it's also understandable concept if a person has been unfortunately raised, been born and raised in our times from several generations. It's absolutely correct to say historically that also in the same moments that we will discuss today, at the end of the 4th century, basically, so that most people had any idea of these things in the first place. And it's always been the case, and this is why it makes all the more relatable. And here we're talking about power dynamics in many ways. There is essentially the change from a state religion to another, right? But there is, in this sense, a base, a political, social one, and also, in fact, a military one if we consider the empire, that at this point is also, in fact, a pagan and a Christian empire. At the same time, if we, in fact, have faith in the idea that there wasn't a real shift as we intended, or say a change that reversibly as a sort of let's say absolute, uniform, factually national reality passed from paganism to Christianity. This is an idea that began to spread, let's say, early in a superficial sense, but when you read the history of it, especially in ancient and medieval times, you realize that was still understood in the actual meanings, and this is evident even from the language, right? From the from the terminology, for example, it didn't change. Like the ideas of fate, of victory, the same empire, right? Of conscience, of a lot of other important spiritual concepts didn't really change in this transition, right? We made of the official, the formal, in fact, kind of crystallized idea of what these polities were, also from a religious point of view, that surely was all one with the intent. In fact, because it was a universal concept, it was not a strictly, local or national, one, etc. Some sort of, again, absolute. Accomplice, it's surely collectivism, statalism, nationalism, and socialism that in the last 2 centuries of our pretty miserable history have basically redrawn the entire historical lexicon for the worst, essentially heading towards a materialism, materialistic, structuralistic, deterministic, relativistic distortion of concepts that, if anybody has even, the basics of Latin literature education, simply can't decipher again through the original meaning of certain concepts, not even needing to have much of a historical religious background, by the way. So today, I don't know how I will title this video yet, but as you may have realized, we will talk about Saint Ambrose, Symmachus, and the removal of the Statue of Victory from the Curia Julia. It's actually a video dedicated to Rome. I started a new series, let's say, in the cycle, dedicated to the history of the city of Rome, from ancient to contemporary era, as a matter of fact. And that, in fact, is one of the most pungent, burning, if you want, and difficult historical events to swallow. Whether you are, I don't know, doesn't matter whether you're a theist or an atheist or specifically a Christian, or you have sympathies towards paganism and or fall in fact entirely in this kind of factionalism that I can assure you is historically inaccurate on a strictly religious ground, because it has to do a bit with the entire change that the greatest empire in the history of mankind underwent as a decline, right? And there is no doubt about that. There's been a huge debate regarding stressing the continuity of late antiquity in fact in a way that would put in discussion even the interpretation of decline. As you know, I also use freely the term Byzantine because I do believe that it has, in this sense, a very serious and heavy meaning to point at what really happened in an empire. It was still the Roman one, but that had changed significantly. And the main change was not, you have to think again, merely as, in fact, national socialistic ideology has habituated you to think it's a mix of singly kind of separated factors, politically, socially, economically, culturally, religiously, as if they were all compartmentalized in their own environment, and you had just to put together a puzzle of things that are still kind of one next to the other without a comprehensive meaning, right? That's the main problem. Nationalism and socialism have destroyed the universal, traditional, imperial capacity, in fact, of having a comprehensive view of the world and of reality. And there is a philosophy of history with which I fundamentally agree, which does see, and it was in fact the one owned by all traditional cultures of, including paganism and Christianity, of a decline, of an irreversible decline, right? It has all to do with the idea of the fall that is present identically both in paganism and in Christianity, because again, they are not two different things, right? We have decided to create them as two different things, but they're not. And nor, that's why I see to that, nor kind of theists or atheists today seem to have an idea about this historical reality. And this is very serious because, in a way, it speaks of that decline. The fact that you can have somebody calling oneself in fact, a theist or an atheist or whatever, but factually not having the palest idea of what that even practically means, right? Being a believer or having an understanding of your own religion is actually a very serious thing that doesn't start from, it's not about Gnostic heresies at all, but quite the contrary to say. It has to do with the action. It has to do with actual faith that is all one with determination, it is all one with works. This was limpidly clear to all paganism as much as it was to Christianity, that was born as within the frame of the absolute universal religion from which no people escaped at the time. The very concept of polytheism is also false, right? And has not even been a Christian creation. It's just, it was created within, of course, a Christian background, but in later times, let's say. But the Christians themselves knew perfectly well that the gods was not a concept alien to the same Bible, right? Most of the Bible is what we would call in erroneously, but still accurately for what they think it means, polytheistic in nature. There are several gods, right? The same plethora of other creation of angels, for example. It's all about it's the pagan world, the winged victory, the alter ego of the individual, the hero, the guardian angel. It's basically the same thing, and it was conceived in that identical concept of struggle and victory and transfiguration. And that's the same reason why Christianity actually owned those meanings, and why they were boosted further in fact, highly universal and militarized societies, like also like all the medieval ones, all the modern ones. You can argue up all the ancien regime ones, right? That we call quite sadly so. But the world ages, and in fact, today's video has to do with that as well, because what we're looking at is, aside from the more concrete conflict that was ongoing in the empire at the time, mostly in an elite fashion, the conception of the same imperium, right, and especially the fitness of those who held it, which was a bit the entire meaning of the universal religion, right? Who was more successful and would win was the one that God had favored, or wanted at least, for a reason or another. That, in a common human language, was pretty evidently the victorious one. And the fact that Christianity took over another paradigm, that rather than a religion that was the official one of the state, is quite meaningful for the same concept of the empire itself, right? And don't think that these things are very far away from our times. I mean, if you look even at the the way contemporary countries justified wars or invasions or taking overs, well, they were essentially looking back at this kind of imperial ideology, which is not a negative thing per se. It's negative when it fails. And it's a very spot-on moral and scientific idea, right? The legitimization and justification of power on the base of victory, as essentially the confirmation of a moral support deriving from the people who are the only ones that can sustain an earthly power, and therefore having a communitary spirit that is also intended in the as the one of victory, and as the one of the same leader, and as the same Holy Ghost within the church. And so what was thought to be an ecumenic reality is all one. It's a very concretely, again, not just moral, but scientific reality, because everything that we know today scientifically, except for the fact that the various scientific branches have lost capacity to speak with one another, that are self-referential, and therefore their scholars do not know this thing, actually agree. Well, if you look again from a comprehensive point of view, agree on this kind of unity. And actual people don't today, because they have been habituated to distrust, to have lack in faith, to use skepticism as a form of moral relativism at the end of the day. To say the fact that you don't know, or that you don't want to know, has nothing to do with what reality is, right? Even in fact when you don't know that, right? So you cannot sclerotize or hypostasize reality even in a scientific formula. It doesn't matter how much it works, because at the end of the day, what matters is not that formula, but what people do, not just with it, but with the rest, which is much more complicated, and it can never be resumed in a formula, but just in action, in leadership, in authority, in discipline, in hierarchy, in irrationality, in nerves, in cold blood. Now, this was the point. What kind of imperium the supporters of the old regime owned, if they were to be taken over by what they considered as a superstition? Now, the concept of superstition is interesting because, by a certain degree, Christianity did spread as a superstition, right? Also, the older religion had spread like a superstition. It was normal in the universal, say, scale of things to have essentially an empire founded on an Apollonian elite and on a Chthonic mass that couldn't really work without one another, right? It's like the principle of male and female. It's like the entire essence of the struggle is the one that leads to victory. The same name of Israel, quite meaningfully, the chosen people of God. By the way, the Romans thought exactly the same about themselves. The Franks would think, the Merovingians especially, would think exactly the same about themselves. In fact, they were perfectly. Charlemagne was more kind of, much more passionate about the Old Testament than about the new one, for that matter, because there was a specific reason. It was all a military cult, and it must be so. I mean, the same New Testament is quite violent and militarized, and there cannot be anything like pacifism within the boundaries of Christianity, if not as a form of deep cowardice and contempt towards creation and fate and reason and the verbum incarnated, for that matter, who came with the sword. And that's not just a metaphor, right? Even if it were, it's a superstition to pretend it is just that, like an empty simulacrum, not very differently from what the one of Statue of Victory had become, because victory was alive, was a living reality, was not, again, just an empty vessel. And that's the point Christianity touched, because we have been heavily influenced also in the history of philosophy and of religions by Nietzsche, and all by, that was essentially an anti-Judaism and an we call it anti-Semitism today, but it would be proper to say in a more specific sense that there was a heavy bias created against the Jewish cultural heritage, etc. And we will not explain why this happened, because it is true that there is a chthonic dimension to Judaism compared to other, say, aspects of the same. Compared to Saint Christendom, there is no doubt that the Gospels are heavily influenced by Indo-European ideology from the Persian Empire. But we will descend into this in another video. But the reality being that still the Old Testament, and let's say, of course, in Christianity, the thing is functional to another. Right, the Old Testament is Holy Scripture for Christians as well, but let's say it's part of a broader evolution, or also of a redeeming, and it speaks of a decline, let's say, and of a resurgence. This happens many times. We also the same Old Testament. Think about the Great Flood. Think about other considerations since the fall in the first place that we can make, but that's yet another topic. What I mean here is that Christianity, whether we like it or not, was pioneering the light in late antiquity. And there are many reasons why this was happening, which were essentially the discovery of a double thread, of a real, of the highlighting and the exaltation and the sublimation in the divine sacrifice, right, of the Son of God, right, and of the Son of Man. That is the ultimate sacrifice. Is the actual immortal transfiguration of the ancient imperatores. Like, Christ essentially accomplished the same, and accomplished the same in spite of any other consideration. That's why, in part, of course, the elite countered Christendom that exposed the symbol of the lowest form of people. I mean, the crucified. Just the scum of the earth was crucified. The lesser people, the unworthy of any form of imperium, were crucified, also because they were the ones who had been killed. The point, though, is that, and this is interestingly debatable within, at least to some within Indo-Europeistics, for the same, at least for the same value that reality has. Like, how many people do you know transfigured, right? The if you read the Roman sagas, the Germanic sagas, you know that, of course, some do. I mean, Romulus transfigured, right, could be another Christ, in a sense. But the point is that in practice, the problem of the fall is not resolved. This is the entire and not proper even difference, because it's liminal and asymptotic between what we call paganism and what we call Christianity. Do we need a medium to be saved? Right? Is that entire ecclesia, in fact, the medium? Is it Christ? You see, or not? Because in the ancient world, the idea, and in the pagan world, let's say in general, that you could transfigure without being redeemed by an external force was the overall concept. Like, people were told in general, that at least and at the highest levels, and that's what the Imperium at the end of the day was about. The Cursio, that is beautifully exemplified by the Imperial funeral, could simply, through his own work, save himself. Right? The Judeo-Christian tradition says it's not possible, because there wouldn't be, value of redemption. There is some, and the redemption is more important than you think, because in order to be redeemed, you must be faulty. And you cannot have the absolute universal power if you are faulty, which means that in theory, the first mistake that you do in the moment you're born just would render you impossible to be saved. Right? We don't know what is the degree for saying. That's still the problem between the non-problem, telling the truth, between Catholicism and Protestantism. The grace works, salvation, etc. In which terms do they really work? What about predestination? What about the omnipower of God? Most of this, the omnipotence of God, most of this concept derives from a deep misunderstanding of a process of modernization and secularization that has nothing to do with the deepest meaning of the universal religion. And given that reality was also in great part a testing ground, it's obvious that if you don't really see anyone transfiguring and you just think that the state religion tells you that that is the case for your leaders that are, definitely flawed and could hardly be, sitting next to the gods as their kin. Well, you start thinking that there may be actually another mean of redemption that you will never know up to the end of your life yourself, and possibly in the greatest accomplishment of all. After all, Christian martyrdom was the same identical process through which this immortal transfiguration occurred in the pagan world, right? That's how you get to heaven. Martyr in Greek means simply witness, and of course witness of Christ, because Christ would appear literally during martyrdom, which was the same identical thing. And we talk about that in the video about that, the doctrine of self-sacrifice, of the fields, etc., and of the Victoria, as a matter of fact, with the soul, the alter ego of yourself. That's why Christ is called the Son of Man, by the way, because it was the same picture of the idea that your soul would be able to divinely transfigure by literally coming out of yourself and taking you to heaven, right? Christ had, of course, this is theologically controversial also, because the same Christianity kind of evolved toward a direction that was aware of such ultimate sacrifice, but let's say wasn't so technicistically, interested in the moment of sublimation, in claiming to define certain things. But let's say that was the actual meaning and the world in which people actually believed this kind of things. That really meant a lot, yes, because it is true also in that kind of Nietzschean perspective that the idea of a medium could be seen as a superstitio, so literally something that stands above. So that's also what the Gnostics complain about, the idea that the Old Testament God is just, the devil, and so it's all a scam, and the other way around. But that's actually a great arrogance and presumption of somebody that presumes, in fact, to save oneself by themselves, right? Have you ever seen some of them transfiguring divinely? Well, I never done it, right? So you can have doubts even about the existence of Christ, whatever. This is not the point. I'm talking about, from a strictly religious point of view, the fallen kind as present in all religions. The Asgard is fucked up. We all know that. It will be stormed by the forces of the wolf, by the barbarians, right? Because the gods made the gold impure, because they called the Nibelungs to build the thing. It's the same myth of Prometheus, right? The same gods at some point screwed up, because we wouldn't be but fallen gods ourselves, right? There is not such thing like a divide, but there is an absolute force, the ultimate one, the one that the darkness has not yet overcome, as the prologue of the Gospel of St. John, that is the most beautiful, the most mystical, the most properly soaked in that kind of, also the closest to dualism, because it properly says and stresses vitally how the struggle was still going on, right? And that's the point that comes to our mind. It is to say, where was the empire in the 4th century, at the end especially of it, when Christianity was taking over, and in a few generations also the barbarians were to storm the Asgard, literally the capital citadel? Well, you see, everything could be prophetically intended. The same barbarians that people complain, oh, look at the Romans were racist because they call other barbarians. Just to inform you about, again, the ABC of history of religions, every single of those barbarians thought that they were the Apollonian heroes, and that there was a scum of the earth race they had to rule on called barbarian or whatever, you know, and simply because they all had the same religion and treated people exactly all in the same way, that is, in the most radically violent and vicious ways that you can ever imagine, right? So before bitching about, the Romans conquered the world, the Romans were the ones that fulfilled the Indo-European Evangelion by literally taking over the world. That is to say, accomplishing what no other people in the history of mankind ever came close to, right? So that's another reason why there was in the Middle Ages something called Holy Roman Empire, ruled mostly by Germans, that, could have called it, Holy German Empire. It wasn't really that, right? And there is a specific reason, because Rome and Romanity are not a personal opinion, right? Because God is not a personal opinion, especially from the side of a stupid fallen kind that is intrinsically evil and corrupt and decayed. And so this is the entire point that surrected, let's say, the imperial force as well. So in the dialogue between Symmachus and St. Ambrose, there are many of these points, let's say, not so kind of religiously illustrated, but quite politically so, and quite meaningfully. And today we'll not read it, actually, but there are certain passages that are beautiful, and there are so many others that could be compared, right? Also the background of these people. We're talking about the ultra-Roman elite, right, the senatorial one, that could perfectly adopt Christianity, in case of St. Ambrose, to define a very powerful concept that is the one, in fact, would remain, that the emperor is within the church, right? And there is also a reason why, when I make those videos talking about the rise of the West and its power in the Middle Ages, how it happened, why did Constantinople fall and the West took off, etc. Well, there is a little thing considered as, in fact, the medium, right, between God and man, that for a Constantinople as an empire would be the same old one, say, of Augustus, where effectively it was the emperor himself, right? And the emperor would have to be, had he been fit for it. In Christian times, they decided to observe that, given that objectively, and this was a massive problem, and it was felt by everyone, just made videos recently about this, that the empire was kind of going worse, that barbarians at the gates were pouring in, and things were definitely decaying. Rome would be sacked in 410, nothing actually so dramatic from a strictly material point of view. The 455 sack was worse, but not even there. Rome was still a florid city until the Gothic War. That there is no such thing like the fall of Rome. It would remain the most important center in the West up to the High Middle Ages. There even just as a city, if we're not talking about the universal meaning that lives still today as the single and unique, the city of the world, right? But the feeling was clear, right? Where's the Imperium? Like, where's the fitness of our rulers to the Imperium? Because the Imperium flies away. In the Persian tradition, there is the legend for which if you even tell a lie once, you will never win again. That is to say, you're done for, right? You will go to hell. You will disappear, in other words, right, from the earth. You will not transfigure divine. You will disappear, and you will not exist. You will not be remembered. There won't be anything of you, because you will have failed in everything for a lie. Putin, you should listen to this. Just for saying how eventually things screw up, because again, when I say that it's a scientific reality, I'm not. This is not an hyperbole. It's not a personal opinion. It's the actual reality, and the point there was deeply felt at the time, because the entire world has rested solely on this belief that there was a time of heroes where emperors were literally worth the transfiguration, and these times were no more, because they were beginning to lose, by the way, to lesser peoples, because yes, objectively the other peoples were, like, it's not that they recreated ever the Roman Empire, whoever came after or whatever. It was a pretty dramatic situation. So I'm not saying that, I don't know, the Germans or others weren't doing still a good job for their own potential, and that they were the ones to which the Imperium would go. But as facts would prove, again, we've never had a Roman Empire to the same extent that had existed in truly in Augustan times. This is not even a materialistic thing, say Trajan or whatever. This is literally what the representation of the Golden Age and the redemption of the world was about. All the Augustan ideology is based on a gospel, and it's not a coincidence that Jesus was born under Augustus, and that the entire prediction of the new Apollo, and that is the same gospel of the entire Indo-European mythology fits with that. So the West went on with another view, with a view of fitness that had to be comforted by spiritual power. Naturally, this doesn't mean that the spiritual power of the church was always fit to the role, right? So, but the idea of a dialogue between the empire and the papacy is what conferred in this constant struggle, but by alliance, again, the same Israel, struggle with God. The chosen people of God is the one that goes through the worst things on earth, as the Holocaust proved. And that's the exact point. Without struggle, you cannot accomplish anything, humanly speaking, right? So the idea of simply establishing an hypothesis of a sclerotic form of, let's say, okay, there is just a hierarchy fixed, and this is not challenged by new forces. There's just an emperor at the top that controls everything, church, people, etc. Brings to a, doesn't matter how powerful the empire had been and how much this thing had lived in the Byzantine phase, still to the final collapse. The West, even in its difficulties and in gradual, at the end of the day, boomed, right, and owned an imperium that unfortunately we have mistaken for some sort of strange secularistic and modernistic, random, mechanistic, structuralistic, relativistic set of coincidences, and that we have not read in a spiritual, in a moral, and in a scientific sense. That is to say, it takes some people with massive moral backbone, not to say anything else, in order to do that. Right, and I think this is pretty evident in historical perspective. And in other words, pretending that there is just an order of things that should remain unchallenged by anyone, and so never test its own worthiness, is just a barbarian thought. In other words, just lesser people reason like this. And this is why ethno-nationalism, socialism, communism fundamentally are based in this concept, right? There's just different degrees of the same path towards the oblivion, because they essentially have bought into the the fourth estate lack of any form of, in fact, individual value, and buying to statalism or collectivism as a point, right? And when I do this, and when I talk about secularism, modernism, statalism, collectivism, I'm not saying that modernity, collectivity, the state, secularity per se are bad at all, right? It's the ism that screws them, and that's it's the tendency towards which this happens that sees the worst, right? There is a good side of what we call modernity, and all these other things that should prove the superiority of the individuals, right? And that instead going the other direction. So again, don't transform these things in some kind of, again, empty vessel to blame, where you are just not achieving anything as an individual in the first place, and complaining because there is somebody who's ruling over you. You are a superstitious person. Like, if you were anything better, you would be ruling. Where's your imperium? In other words, why don't you hide yourself in shame just for being in that state? That's the lack of shame and human dignity that we're witnessing today without any restraint. And that's why people, in fact, don't even understand history or religion or any other concept of sacredness and the point of the truth, right? And its meaning and its usefulness anymore. But we will make plenty of other videos on these issues. So we will talk at some point about how many noble Romans had converted to Christianity. There is, through the same religion, a lot of hagiography that exemplifies this phenomena. Some of them were very painful, and you would literally spot in some of these people's behaviors certain actually neurotic patterns of some sort, some serious diseases that would bring him into death in a form that would be comforted as some sort of self-sacrifice or whatever, but that can be read in part as superstition. There is no system that is devoid of darkness together with light, right? So there are bad aspects of Christianization, especially the destructive ones, the iconoclastic ones, at some point at least. In fact, the kind of even the compromising ones that we will see today, that not even tolerance is a value, right? The fact that you can be intolerant without destructing, but making, right, but building over, and in great part the same Christianity did so, right? The same continuity with pagan temples and with certain institutions and certain meanings and values helped preserving great part of classical civilization that in fact lives in the imperium within the same Christendom and as the same medieval empire and beyond, for which we are also very thankful just from a strictly historical or archaeological point of view, because frankly, even in Europe and even in the same Rome, we have to dig we have actually dug only a minimal fraction of what our civilization produced. But I'm talking about by massive scale. You think that what we see in Rome today is just, it, right? Rome has to be completely dug. Of course, by a certain degree, because of the contemporary city, it can't be done as one would like to. But let's say we know that, right? And it's not just about Rome. Of course, the most ancient urbanized areas, the most archaeologically stratified, mostly, in fact, in the same Italy and in other, say, part of the regions where the same Roman Empire consolidated the most because of previous civilization as well. But let's say we're talking about the entire continent. Like, even just in medieval times, we have an enormity of things. I am pretty disappointed when I see on YouTube people are fixated for some reason on knowing how Rome kind of, just collapsed. That's part of that same destructive kind of chthonic Dionysian need of of nihilism at the end of the day. How many people are actually interested in the massive, but I mean really massive amount, for example, of early medieval Roman cultural legacy? Just the same amount, the churches, but most of this was also already present there in late antiquity. But what they meant, what history was beyond that, and how behind that, and how much of these very meanings that we just discussed are actually depicted, symbolized, and expressed in that. Most people haven't even an idea that these things exist. And it's not just by listing, I don't know, the Vatican museums or St. Peter or the Colosseum or whatever, the Forum, etc., that you say, oh, that Rome, basically, Rome is like, just literally a minimal fraction of that. And in order to understand it, you should at least study anything historical. Also, during the Middle Ages, the modern age, to have any idea of what we're talking about and why this, the actual dimming of our awareness of the sacred and of our civilization in our own lives has been dying, right? Thanks to ourselves, to our fallen kind, to our lesser part of ourselves that is the one that has become predominant, right? So it's obvious that at the time, many Romans would see the advent of Christianity as basically the same. It's as if, there's a major moment of crisis, and people start distrusting and do not want to keep up the old system anymore, and they're taken over by some sort of pathological attitude. Christianity spread in ways that comforted these aspects because the people wanted to be comforted by, or to twist that kind of meaning, right? In the early Middle Ages, like of all the formal Christians, how many people do you think they understood anything about Christianity or even about the old religion? Most of them were chthonic masses. When people talk about the pagans, the rural reality, they want to this is pure bullshit, kind of ecologism of the 1970s. This spread from a Marxist rape of pagan culture and tradition. We're talking about the least element. We're talking about the chthonic mass. We're talking about the ones that were subjugated by all the polities that had existed before, Romans, Celts, Germans, in every area of Europe, and that had always remained the lesser, right? And sometimes we exchange them in evident chthonic cults as, this were our ancient tradition. Look at, there are some countries where this still happens. There is nothing really to be proud of that, right? Especially the most materialistic, gross, kind of physical ones, considering superstitions, inhumation, etc. That's just the darkness that has taken over. It's not the... also in mild terms, I'm saying that inhumation is bad per se, but still, an archaic Roman feudal lord would have never been interred in that sense, because they believed, of course, that also the transfiguration, that the material side of the story didn't matter in that sublimation of force. And of course it really mattered, and Christianity brought also inhumation in that sense to prove that we are connected between the two things. But it was also because the majority of people did it already, and so it was the broader temper of times that not even Christianity could change in that idea of the transfiguration. Christ is not buried anywhere. Why? Right? Because he transfigured, and the humans did not. And there is no... and this is the problem. That's the fallen kind. And that's why even Christianity would accept that, in the humility of the realization that, if you're not, Christ come from the second time after the advent of the Antichrist, well, it's quite unlikely you can be, even in life, fully emulating his deeds, because you're not perfect, you're not God, right? So there's the concept of sanctity and the hierarchy of this sense of these accomplishments. But the idea is that the most, in fact, superstitious, more cultistic and materialistic aspects of life, like just being fixated with physical death itself, or fearing it. Well, it's a typical trait of the pre-Indo-European Bronze Age Pelasgian thing. They were scared of blood, of things, but whereas the conquerors were constantly covered in it for that matter, just considering their lifestyle, because they looked at the earth, at the dirt, at the animals, at the underworld, where they feared they would be lost and dismembered and cancelled forever. Whereas the Indo-Europeans look at the stars, that were just the transfigured heroes that had made it there, right? Of all the many that had tried, right? And it was a brutally strict and extremely elitistic concept for that. In its extremization really means, but is any of us worth of that, right? And Christianity, in a sense, was answering that question. So the Roman senators were not just those who held, in fact, according to materialistic history and socioeconomic stuff, the power, the wealth, etc., but they were the people who, in fact, also believed they were the closest to that kind of moral value that could bring to transfiguration. But also that culture had changed, and I made a video about the moral superiority of Roman civilization, in which I explained how great part of the Roman success was also due not just to the, in fact, incredibly hardcore, absolute, and radical Indo-European revival that the Roman elite put up, but also the capacity embodied literally by the Roman legions, were just the Chthonic mass, but brutally trained and in fact capable of bringing to transfiguration the imperator at their head by the same, in fact, elite that was that example of Imperium. But in fact, the same threat posed in parts of pre-Roman Italy by the spread of the Pelasgian cult, of the pre-Indo-European kind of, among even Indo-Europeans, many think even about the Sabines had these tendencies, other Oscans, etc., that had, in a way, according to, again, the Indo-European Evangelium, in all the Indo-European mythologies, had began to forget, right? Their awareness, their consciousness, of the sacred had been dimming, because they had been bought by the riches of the conquered lands and so on. The Romans trigger something never seen before, and the striking point with Christianity is from which, in fact, the latter draws, with St. Paul, also a dramatic amount of lexicon, and we made a video about that, also about the Militia Christi, for example. The idea that everybody can be redeemed, that in the very concept that anybody, if serving Rome, will prove to be fit through the munus, which is a duty and a right at the same time, right? We live in an age where only rights exist, where are duties, like rights without duties have no value, right? And don't lament yourself if they're calpested, stepped on, because a right and duty cannot exist without one another, right? It's just like the Apollonian and the Dionysian, or the male and the female. They exist without one another. There is no point in it. It's not human. It's not real. It's just a fiction. It's false. Well, this was given, the idea that nobody is beyond redemption, right? This is the Evangelium that also Augustus, in taking over the world, representating the Golden Age and healing the fracture that had occurred within the chosen people during the civil wars, because of a sacrilegium, by the way, think always about the sacred in its meaning, had extended to all the peoples in the world. In other words, Rome was just a huge feudal empire that emanated its own superiority by managing to transfigure all the rest of the world. They were, of course, considered as lesser people because none of them had taken over the world. So there was no way around that. There were some who had accomplished it better than others. Think about the Greeks with Alexander, other important powers. But the concept is that Rome had topped that in absolute terms, and we are still awaiting for anybody doing the same thing yet again. And the theory goes that this will not happen. And in the traditional quadripartition of the various human eras, there is a point in several traditional cultures say there is this moment, right, before or during the Iron Age, in which there will be a between the Bronze and the Iron one, in which there will be a temporary re-establishment that would correspond to the Augustan one, before we will fall in the darkness and Satan will come to rule over us before the final battle and see. And again, Christianity is more optimistic in a way. Even, you see that the gates of hell shall not prevail against her, right? If you read other sources, also from the same Bible, there are different concepts. So there is definitely a tension within the same Bible, which is extremely complex as a text, extremely stratified, superimposed, articulated, kind of rearranged. But it's that belief. It's the idea that, and that's where there is a criticism, because it kind of says, well, okay, well, the gates of hell will not prevail. But if you read, again, the Gospel of St. John and other references in general in Christianity, you see that idea of eternal struggle can never be over if you want to think to even succeed, if you can even hope to succeed. And not just by, again, wishful thinking. So this dialogue, right, was extremely strong. And the reason why I'm digressing on this is because, you see, an Augustus would have literally believed in this. Of course, late Republic and early Imperial Roman society was already displaying those traits, the kind of the masses, kind of parasitically living in this kind of welfare kind of idea of state building, and because that was necessary, if anything, again, for state building, because there is a natural, unavoidable relaxation when you achieve power. This is, again, all what we know, so psychologically, humanly, biologically speaking, that there is always that moment of which you have to project yourself further once you have accomplished something, because you should have accomplished that by true success and through the awareness of your success, capitalizing upon it further, because you have acquired new power to struggle more. As we will see now with the Christians, but we're talking about St. Ambrose, who was literally not even baptized when he was called to be the Archbishop of Milan, that he, became beautifully and fundamentally, especially for the true Western Christian identity, to exactly point this out against other senators, just like him. These were all Roman senators, right? The bishops took over in that guise. They were the same families, the same people. Where were you now when the empire was declining? Because we will see what Symmachus had written about this. Symmachus basically was letting go, saying, well, Rome is old now, respect the old lady. And the question is, but what kind of point is that? Rome is not an old lady. It should be victory, unleashed, unchained, in absolute sense, continuously struggling and winning. And who was winning at this point was Christendom, rather, even over that previous system. So the dialogue is of radical intensity, right? Because it shows you the dying character, not of the empire, of the Roman Empire, but of the fitness of the single individuals. What you respect is not the person, but the office, right? And this is what we should be learning to do with our institutions. People who bail out of state, there is the shrinking and the delusion of modern conservatism, for example, is evident in the fact that they are doing and thinking the same identical thing the left does. So simply bind all the tectonic stuff, destroy the state, let's revert just to minimal concept like what you look like in terms of what you're worth without proving any worth whatsoever. Right? They're buying the same identical things. Essentially, white supremacism is critical race theory. It's the same identical concept, right? So you would be quite disturbed by that if you had, in fact, any form of culture, but people don't have any form of culture anymore, right? The point I'm making here goes also beyond, because again, it's just like the state. The state here was crumbling, or at least was being shattered. The same thing today. There's especially a certain part of world conservatism that thinks, we have to decentralize everything. You have to decentralize everything when you're not doing anything, right? In other words, you cannot first of all count on the average person today to be any reliable by any standard. And if they're weak, somebody must command them, because they will simply let themselves be commanded. And I'm not going to pay for that person just to be a parasite if I don't actually rule that person. It seems a perfectly logical concept. It's the same idea that stands at the idea of universal tradition, and that's why also any Christian who thinks to be a communist is just, you should just feel ashamed for even having had a thought. But also, right, if you don't organize it, you don't put together. What did the Germanic chieftains really do when they had go to war? They elected a chief. The same goes for the princeps, for the imperator, among the Roman nobility. When you achieve something, when you have to win, you have to put things not in common property, but for common effort. You have to struggle in order to win. And Rome took over because it powered dramatically its state to expand. So a state that does not evolve, does not structure itself, doesn't achieve anything. And the reason why the state eventually will abuse power is because people will let that happen. It's not evil tyrants. There is not a single person in the world that can rule another without that other's consensus. Not even one. This is as simple as it gets. So, aside from tyrannous paranoias, right, evaluate the quality of people, right? And that's the same reason why an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship or totalitarianism suck, because what actually means there is that the quality of the people living in those countries is worthless, to be ruled by scumbags, and doesn't, as a form, have any value, right? For which you instead think that, again, just like a statalist collectivist, whatever form of government it is, it's better or worse. You are completely taking away human worth out of the equation. And chances are because you don't have any yourself. And you don't even know what it means. And that's the sad reality we have gotten to. Well, so at this point, we get a bit more into the Roman side of the story. Because again, the empire continued. That's why we all know that. Right. It continued as a Christian state. In Rome, say, I have an important degree of sympathy towards the Western elite in late Roman times, because it was something about them that, as we've seen also in that recent video that had many, that was liked so much about how the Romans chose to be Germans. These were the same people who eventually chose another model from the Roman one in areas that they still continued to rule over, because as we've seen also, the Germanic migrations didn't bring to any significant manpower to force millions of people to do what they wanted, but it was an actual cooperation. That's the beginning in a brutal phase of contraction of the world, as we know, where the West start to rebuild dramatically its own imperial grandeur. I made a video about the Merovingians and Clovis that speaks specifically at that, as the Franks is, the Merovingian Empire is the spring of European civilization, as in medieval times. Not even that, however, would achieve what the Romans did. So that idea of dimming, like of declining, of this impulses of heroic struggle that still fights and doesn't and will die if necessary, but doesn't give up in spite the world is declining. The second principle of thermodynamics says that, right? So just again, traditional cultures were fully aware of this, but that's where you're tested, right? And that's why, by a certain degree, it's not really how important whether you win or lose in the universal picture, I said, but how you win or lose, right? And so, especially how you lose, because we're going to lose anyway, all. And prove me wrong, right? Because that's what we're waiting for, right? For somebody to represent the golden age again. And have you met anybody? No. So the point I'm making is, of course, then that, however, this is a kind of a big timeline. So in practice, in the real life, you should always be winning, right? Because especially winning over somebody else, because this is, at the end of the day, what happens on Earth. We're still justice does not belong, because that's what's also the concept of redemption, because exactly we are the fallen ones. So even he who wins is not immune from some fault, right? That's also how the Augustan Imperium was shattered at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, right? And why it was important to ransom that, to get the eagles back, as it happened, by the way. Because the idea is that the struggle never ends, right? But we are all imperfect by a certain degree. So the Roman elite was objectively the single and most radically educated one you could imagine, historically. And this is true especially, I mean, at the time of the empire. This is true especially even considering at this point almost 1 century had passed after the foundation of Constantinople, and so what we call as properly the Byzantine state was objectively another kind of state, as it had. I made several videos on the Constantinian state and Senate, etc. And then also I made a video about the Western nobility, so highlighting the several differences that existed. The East was much more meritocratic, but the people were much more kind of bureaucrats, kind of people coming from the ranks, by merit, but just to be controlled by the emperor. So lesser people in a way. The Westerners still believed to be that kind of race of demigods who had made the empire, and that was preserving that moral and biological superiority by maintaining their own moral standards, that however had significantly declined themselves, because again the world ages, and we'll see how, right? So there was a great resistance to Christianity that was telling them essentially, recognize that you're not good anymore. By a certain degree, you've never fully been, and so there is no other mean of salvation but by having faith in the ultimate sacrifice. So in other ways, in accepting that the Asgard will be stormed, right? That you will be killed in the worst ways, and that you cannot fully escape that, so that you don't have the full control on yourself as you had believed. This denied the imperial religion, of course, in the way it had been institutionalized, because people really believed that emperors had transfigured, which Christians did not. So this is a very delicate topic, and it would be worth enough to explain, to motivate all the dramatic hatred and still sense of malaise that we feel for a reason or another in this struggle between the old Roman religion and Christianity, and so how objectively how bad a topic it is, because it just exposes ourselves to the reality that we are all kind of a fallen kind, and that's perhaps the only reconciliatory way to get past it healthily, let's say. Naturally, the Roman senators, so at this point, of course, the Romanization had encompassed Gaul, Spain, Africa, beyond, right? Italy was not the true strategic center of the empire anymore. Not even factually the political one, because Constantinople had travalicated that, but there were other more important cities in that sense, strategically than in political practice than Rome, like Trier, Milan, Nice, Nicomedia, the same Constantinople. But of course, it was beyond any form of discussion, like it's been to this day, that Rome was the sole center of the world. It was the only holy city that, of course, both the pagans and the Christians saw as such for obvious reasons, as it had been founded by Romulus, and Peter and Paul had been martyrized there. So there's no escape, right? If you want to be an ecumenic ruler, you must control Rome or nothing, right? So there are no alternatives of any kind, because the Romanity had managed to stand out, right? That this is the importance also of Christianity, of the papacy in the history of Christendom, because Romanity remains also, in fact, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the Roman Catholic Church. So Romanity became an equation of universality for everyone, right? And that's, again, the reason why, at least up to the Reformation, this was recognized anyway. And still, before the secularization of Napoleon, there was a Holy Roman Empire, and why, after all, there still is a papacy that, in this sense, has a much greater legacy than one would think. So the old capital of the empire, where the privileged positions connected to the ancient rites, the ancient pagan rites that were institutionalized in the Roman state, were naturally more consolidated, and paganism seemed harder to die. Julianus Apostata, for example, made a couple, maybe even actually just one video about him. From the end of the 50s of the 4th century, in 363, a very short reign after all, in spite of his achievements, became the restorer of the ancient religion by a certain degree, right? But it was all part of this very kind of religious feudalism, for which, in fact, even the old paganism was hardly felt and believed and performed ritually in the traditional way, right? Scipio would have been horrified to see also what kind of Roman religion was in Caesar times. Caesar would have been horrified what was seen, in Hadrian's time, right? So things change. Julianus believed in an enotheism, right? In many ways, it was the same thing, right? It's the standards that changed. It's the practices that changed. And most of this tended towards that kind still of massification. Like Julianus believed, surely in a much more, let's say, had of course a much more oligarchic view of even of power, what it was. Like, Augustus was just a primus inter pares, because the idea was, as we were saying before, that also regarding modernity, that a state where everybody's powerful, or at least where the extended elite is effectively an elite of semi-divine individuals, can be strong, right? A purely monarchic structure where everything depends only on one guy, and all the rest of the people are just like the colonists, that the entire subjects that the empire was becoming, like, is not a great, recipe for prosperity. This can be seen also in even among the same Germanic peoples. There are some that prevailed over others because they had a very robust middle class, very active political and military warriors that crushed, peoples that had been impoverished because the elites had kind of, oligarchs taken over everything, right? So this is documented historically, archaeologically. It's not a game. So be very careful before you speak against things like modernity if you don't understand even the traditional value that they actually own, right? That's the same thing of Christianity. It's giving the possibility to anyone to redeem oneself. But the point is that at the time it was meant to be like a real thing, not just wishing, right, to be, of just emptily being absolved but not repenting. That sacrament will be useless, right? In the eyes of God. So you should have known better. Of course, if a person didn't even know anything about this because he just belonged to the Chthonic mass and believed that everything depended on making some physical offers to the deity and not accomplishing anything else, well, just that material offer just quantified the worth of his humanity, right? And so a pretty low cost, with the unavoidable problems for the rest of the people, of the collectivity. So the even so, this great restoration that Julianus attempted was not particularly successful, as you know, in the first place, but one could even question the intentions there and why eventually emperors accepted Christianity. Constantine, as you know, was quite ambiguous. He was basically at the head of the pagan tradition as much, the pagan religion of state as much as the Christian one, at least as a protector. So it was important to control this new religion in order to draw the best of what it offered for the sake of government. And Constantine, in that sense, was pretty far-sighted, right? If anything, because his empire managed to resist 1,000 years and more, but still with some characters of, instead, the bad side of modernity that didn't really work as well as it would happen instead in the West, still as a Christian civilization. Now, in Rome, Julianus didn't need to take many measures against Christianity after all, exactly because the urbs was still very attached to paganism in a deeply rooted way, and therefore it was more necessary to commit in other directions for the restoration of the older tradition rather than in the capital. That crawled, in fact, of loyal subjects that were ready to fight in order to actually put back the pagan deities in their temples, in their own niches. But this is the point when we talk about deities, because, as we were saying before, this was not any form of actual polytheism. I mean, it was polytheism exclusively, and wrongly in the sense, even in comparison with what we mean as monotheism. Because if you want monotheism to be a real monotheism, you must cancel angels. Just to make an example, you should even, not canceling the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, but essentially the concept behind all those different gods is that these gods were just the emanation of the main one, of the more powerful one. In the case of Jupiter, in the case of the Romans, in the case of Woden hangs himself, he sacrificed himself, just Jesus on the cross, to essentially reach that new state, right? So this was all meant to be. And again, the end of times and even the occultation of Woden is the same. There are many references to this in many other religions, many equivalents to that, because it was understood. It was always about the doctrine of self-sacrifice, right? But again, this is the point that also the late Romanity had not been immune from that dimming of realization. So what all those idols really had become were just, just quite materialistically, again, make an offer to this and that god, and then it will be it, right? It was not about your action anymore. I mean, that had to embody an action, but it had become formal. It had become not based on intention and on fate and on your direct control of that sphere, that divine sphere, as peers. It had become a superstition. It had become, there are the gods above. Literally, if you read even the letters of Symmachus, etc., you realize that it speaks of that. Even goes as far as saying that Christianity, independently from how we see things, we live under the same gods, under the same sky. Like, those Indo-Europeans that came from the Caucasus to be in Central Europe, to be eventually the Italics, the Romans, would have never seen themselves like that, right? They would have just struggled to become gods themselves, not to appease them, but to just be peers with them. And of course, part of the Roman ritual was about that, but mentally, morally, aptitudinally, most people just took this like, oh no, that guy, because most people lived under these clients, as clients under the senators, these individuals that performed the rites, that had all these institutional posts, and say, that guy will be the thing, will do the thing. This had been, because in turn, I stand to the senator as the senator stands to the god, right? So let's hope that the gods will do this. It was never about that. It was about the value of people, and this is what even Saint Ambrose did. The reason why Rome was great, because he was a Roman. There was no such thing like Christians hating Christianity. It was a Roman functionary. He was not even Christian. He was born in a Christian family, but he was not even baptized before becoming Archbishop of Milan. The emperor wanted him there. Said it's the greatness of figures like Camillus, like Scipio, etc., that made Roman great. It was their valor. It was what they did, not what they were whining for. Please no, do not eliminate the statues from the temple. How are you even, like, if you were to fight and die for it, how do you even think that a letter would be the equivalent of it? How do you think that even the gods would respect you, or why the whole thing would work and you would be up to the task, and the eternal struggle against darkness could be won if that's your kind of attitude? It sounds like what we're witnessing in the current decadence today, with that meme with the hyper, beefy, muscular, going to the gym dog compared to that is hyper cool and does things, and that there's the same fat, obese, sad-looking dog that doesn't do anything, that's so lazy and doesn't want even to move. That's the same kind of idea of how things decline and degenerate, and at the end of the day disappear, right? Because they're not alive anymore. They become empty simulacra. And of course, again, this was part of the process. You could not surely take this away. Let's say that's why Christianity took time to impose itself, by the way. I don't know, in Augustine times, because just like Pilatus says, quid est veritas, to Christ, according to you, by the way, because the phrase there is very deep, and say, what you actually mean. But even in that question, there is the fallen kind that is impressed by that, is still fearful of the truth and respectful in a sense. Pilatus, after all, is sins not much because he lets, per se, Christ being killed, right? Because he was still his own authority, but because he basically lets others decide. That's a terrible thing, right? It's if you read Dante's Inferno, you know that they wouldn't choose politically, and they're not even worth to be in hell with the other damned, right? That's how hateful this lack of action really is, and that's very meaningful for this story. As we've seen also with Julianus, this kind of pagan revival was quite short-lived. There was no quite Julianus also died, tragically enough for the empire, because he was about probably to crush the Persians. Yet, I mean, definitely and surely his campaigns prove how dramatically advanced the 4th century Roman army really was, compared to any other thing that the Romans had ever put out there. But that was also God's will in the big scale of things. So in 380, you have the definitive victory of Theodosius, that won't be really definitive, as you'll see now, up to 394, 95 when he died. Okay. Because of many other issues that, however, the Christian emperor manages to settle. I made a video about Theodosius and Saint Ambrose and all the problems of the Gothic Federati that is quite relevant in that political, strategical, and even religious balance. Today we don't talk about that, but as you know, Theodosius will confer new space to Christianity and will definitely put aside the past rites, the temples, the divinities that were represented there, the statues, the precious mosaics, and for example, the ones that still revived the Via Sacra, also known as the most beautiful street in the world, and that really had a name there, given that it connected the Regia, the Comitius, and the Arx Capitolina, by the way. So these were archaic memories that were destined to lose plausible value and meaning. Also, this had never been all alike. There had been, think about the same Temple of Jupiter, it had gone destroyed already several times because of fires and would be destroyed again. So Rome changed face as well. So in spite of the meaning, we're seeing here again that Rome is not quite the center of the Imperium anymore. Even though it couldn't but remain, unavoidably, its own truest symbol. But with the Edict of 380, Thessalonica, the affirmation of the following 2 years, paganism will practically exit history, as it was expelled from the same city of Rome, while between 350 and 360, the ruling class still, however, appears in part to be tied to the traditional divinity and seems still ready to, exploit any situation to resume the still familiar pagan religious practices, right? Again, most of these practices were also had been modified over time. Had been institutionalized, had been ritualized, again, in ways that can be identified. Like, surely Augustus would have not been happy of the way they were performed at that point. What kind of political reality Rome had turned into, or social reality had turned into. Again, just like, our grandparents would have been horrified. Okay, this was a longer time, but just to make you understand, also because the world speeded dramatically, just from our grandparents' youth to today, would have been astonished. Right, one of my great grandmothers said that the world would have ended when women would have dressed trousers. I mean, she lived enough probably to see to see some women wearing trousers. Maybe not where she lived, but let's say that's the kind of mindset, right? So you can imagine how much had gone on, properly even in the same vision of the monarchy and of its powers, institutional powers, something radically different from just a few centuries before. So we have really, even if we have nostalgia for tradition, we have to realize there was no such thing like an altered tradition, or that everything was fine until Christians arrived, and so most people were also openly anti-clerical or atheists, saying those damn Christians. Still, there are many conservatives that believe genuinely that the accomplishment of civilization started when we started abandoning religion, or at least we began to get rid of it in certain secular modern ways, right? Literally from the light, as if in the Middle Ages nothing really happened, civilization, right? No, don't worry about it. It was just a a dark hole, and nothing else. Well, unfortunately, we have grown even sensible, potentially sensible people into believing this madness, and to the point that anyone was never simply, as I am not, for example, making the straight point as just this criticism of the old tradition performance from scientific people proves that everything was kind of simply better. But it depended on the people. This is of the single individuals, and there was some meanings that we have simply decided to distrust. I mean, there are people who still. I think the main belief in the contemporary world, at least in the civilized countries, is that, you know, somebody who started writing books saying this is the truth destroyed civilization, right? And the only reason why they think that is that they literally don't know that at a certain point people began to write things down, and that before that people believed actually the same identical thing, that the truth did exist, and that this has massive moral and scientific implications that, if anything, had to do with developing the same civilization on which we rest from nothing that existed before. Right, so the total lack of humility, of education, of culture, of self-respect, of dignity, of anything that you can imagine as being paraded today as the main kind of, the normal thought, right, together with a lot of other bullshit, frankly, such as that making children is wrong because there's no space on Earth, really? There are no resources, really? Who's told that? Where is it written? I mean, seriously, because it sounds like, you know, the entire things that have been written scientifically about that tell the exact opposite. And that literally more means that you are too lazy and irresponsible and nihilistic and empty and useless not to want to have a family because you're not capable of having one. It's another thing. Just like the minimalist today is just another way of saying you're poor, or that, you know, other simulacra. Yes, this is the beautiful term that the Latins left us with. So, with say, together with those rights, of course, as we're saying, there was lots of political power attached. Right, in the first rank, there was 3 members of the very important Symmachus that were one of the greatest, most noble, most elite families in Rome. These were Aurelius Avianus, Symmachus, these are all the cognomen eventually, Quintus Aurelius, and Fabius Memmius, who all came to the most prestigious. Even distinguishing civil from religious is wrong here, but just to make you understand, offices. We're talking about the prefecture of Rome, the proconsulship, the quaestorship, the pontificate, and the senatorial dignity. And the 3, and these were ever more elite stuff, right, considering those times, also because there had been a further segmentation of the same nobility in a more hierarchical sense. So these 3 individuals, besides being principled and quite skilled administrators, were men of letters, rhetors, of very high value. And next to them, we can remember Vettius, at the time we can use the soft. Vettius Agorius Praetextatus and Nicomachus Flavianus. The first covered the usual cursus honorum, for which he will be granted also the erection of statues while he was still alive, as an homage and recognition for his own activity. And that's yet another thing that speaks of the, in fact, descleritization of the system, because statues normally were a statue was the heron, right? Only heroes were owed. This was originally an Hellenic practice, were owed a statue. And after they had transfigured divinely and immortally, right, the late Greeks instead, when in fact they were taken over by the Romans, had instead started to make statues to people that not only were still alive when they, this images were erected, but also hadn't really done anything special aside from being, normal administrators and politicians. So this is a bit the same story, right? It's glorifying a power that is becoming empty. These people could afford such power and prestige because, of course, also the statue was functional to that kind of order and rule, etc. But this order and rule was suffering also from the internal and the external, as all these broader problems of the empire witness, and therefore they are also the symbol of something that had not gone particularly well, right? So of course, these were practices that were carried out in ways that we can't really blame there were different types of representations as well that could be possible also in life, but only occasionally, and this had mostly affirmed itself, in fact, with the monarchy, right? Statues that are also public monuments, or to be, in fact, there's nothing public that is not religious. That's the other bullshit that you have been told, that Christianity hijacked the state. There was no state ever up to a few centuries ago that was not solely and exclusively based on religion in literally any single aspect, without any form of exception anywhere at any time. The state existed exclusively because there was a religion and a military power, nothing else, and they were all one, right? So this is like the ABC really of history of religions. I'm not. Some people may think that I'm kidding, or I'm trying to make some kind of paradox, myth busting. This is what you literally learn in any first year of history of religion manual. This is not just in real public schools, public universities, that still work, right, as such, right? And so a communistly hijacked one could not teach you these things, by the way. And I didn't go to any Christian institute in my whole life, telling, by the way. So the point here, however, is clear. The contemporaries called Vettius Agorius Praetextatus the prince of religion and the deep connoisseur of all what concerns spirituality, right? So he was literally embodying religious knowledge, which is also kind of problematic because most of the Roman tradition was, as you know, had collegial institutions, and it was really there was a separation between, let's say, a repartition of roles in different people. So this had tended instead to come closer, and so also being very at a point different, if not sacrilegious, at some level from the older religious standards. His wife Aconia Fabia Paulina, in the funerary epigraph that concerns her, is praised for having preserved in her heart the truth revealed through holy initiations, and for having honored the multi-form power of the gods that have determined her life and the one of her husband. In this language, there is all the diametric, the shift from the Augustan, the traditional, the Apollonian, into the tectonic, the superstitious. In practice, in deterministic, right? First of all, the idea that you have to be initiated simply. Yes, there were different initiations since the origins of Roman religion, but this the idea of having maintained in her heart the truth revealed speaks already the same language of Christianity, speaks already the idea that the truth must be revealed through a medium, that there is an ever greater distance also between this, say, the human and the divine. Exactly what is complained by all the Nietzschean tradition, saying, and the racists frankly want to say, the Jews had put this kind of thing in between the sky to heaven, and man was a false god, etc. What is this revelation of the truth? It sounds pretty much Judeo-Christian to me. The point is that it's not really Judeo-Christian, it's a broader concept that was pretty much alive in the pre-Indo-European substratum, and that, yes, also the other non-Indo-European peoples, in fact, like the Jews, etc., had, partly bought into, for reasons now we don't digress on, but I will make a video on it, that was more deeply Platonic, that stressed that, first of all, like the Jews at least look to the sky, right? So that's a very interesting aspect of the story. There is always a commixture, as we were saying, also in Roman religion, there is also in Germanic religion, in any of them, there is the Apollonian and the Chthonic. If you look at the Norse part, it's even stronger, because there the Indo-European settlement was more sparse, and there was a much greater continuity by a degree of the Chthonic threat, right? Read the giants, the things. Peoples like the Dorians, the Italics, the Latins, that we don't know how they really called themselves originally, but had instead established as, having taken over this much richer areas, like the idea that they had literally founded a new order. This was especially true in the Hellenic world. It could not be changed. It also contributes to that kind of insulation of the same Hellenic and Byzantine culture later on, thinking that there was nothing more perfect than them. Outside, everybody was a barbarian, point, end of the story. And it was a risky sclerotization. The Romans were so successful because they emerged from a reality where they were also constantly challenged, where they had experienced the dimming of the divine awareness in their souls, to reemerge in absolutely, and knowing their enemies much more closely, looking into the abyss and testing yourself according to that. So this concept, however, is that the gods are they have this multi-powers that determine human life. An ancient Roman would have never believed this. Yes, maybe a plebeian would have believed this, but a senator, just not even the time of Camillus or Scipio, or even now in Augustan times, or a few just even later, would have never thought that the gods would determine the life of, by the way, some of the most powerful people out there. They would think that that could happen by a margin, but by how faulty they could be. But the intention was to change your own destiny. True, even the propitiation of the gods, but in the sense of engaging with them and interacting with them, not being determined by them, or being under them, or having this revealed truth that makes the gods just, by performing a sacrifice, making the thing entirely, and just waiting for the thing to be determined. You had to do that, right? This was the first idea, action, direct action, power. This is what St. Ambrose, as a Christian, answered at that point about the great heroes of Rome. It was their value. It was not the determination of the action. I made a very important video that is entitled The Fortuna Caesaris, which is about Caesar's cosmological role in Roman civilization, in fact his relation with the goddess Fortuna, that for the Romans, in a very Clausewitzian strategic sense, had a radical, because they were a strongly militarized people, had a radical impact in every kind of endeavor, right? Where you realize exactly there that there is nothing determined, that Fortuna comes and goes, and you know how to take her, literally, and she can reward you if you do the right things, but it's all up to you. And Fortuna is above even the same gods, right? And they surely venerated her still in the Symmachus times, but surely this determination was felt in a very different way from Caesar's one, that had to come out of the sphere of the res publica herself, in her ecumenic, almost ecclesiastical meaning, and rearrange as a fact, as eventually he would be deified for the accomplishment, the order, pave the road for actually Octavian to restore the Golden Age after the broken order, and paving the road for that. And this is all documented, like on the base of what politically, religiously Caesar left, from a historical point of view, for us to be documented. What you see in the late empire is that paganism has turned already into a form of determinism, of chthonic superstition herself. This uses the same Christian language, at least by the degree in which you want to just feel yourself, let go, like decide, letting God decide, as many Christians do. Say, God will think about that, and what about you? You don't, you give up any responsibility. What kind of Christian are you? Right? That's an insulting way of being a Christian, as a matter of fact, because it's obvious that God and the truth are omnipowerful. The knowledge is, but you are bound to that. That must motivate you to act upon it, right? Not to remain there sitting doing nothing while people die all the time, where the world goes on. It's being shipwrecked by the forces of evil, and you're just sitting there doing nothing. What kind of Christian are you? And that's why true Christianity is an Apollonian religion. It talks of the heavens. Hell is a non-place. It's your non-existence and dissolution at the end of an unworthy life that everybody should be concerned of, because again, we cannot hope, even through works, to make it on our own, decisively, right? But still, we have to do enough of what we think we can, or even what we think we can't, but still try, right? This is fundamental. How can be determine the life of someone? Naturally, this concept was known also to the pagans here, and they knew the meaning. So I'm not saying that here specifically from the epitaph of Fabia Paulina, or also in the precepts of the Symmachus in general. This idea did not exist, or that they had turned into something sloppy and imperfect. But at the same time, the actions and the action of the empire there should have made them ask, like, why are we losing? What is that we did wrong? Well, something you must have done wrong, and so this also lack of, of check, like of dialogue with a spiritual entity that can challenge you constantly and not making you feel like you're so pure and brave and you are just the best, and it is necessary for your improvement. This is very debatable, because you can hardly go to a person, unless of course they do something terribly wrong, and be fully aware of what's the inner side, especially if it's a very complex one. And these were hardly, these were the most developed people out there, were surely the most deserving by certain standard, but still not enough to maintain the reins of the empire. For example, another aspect of this determinism, Nicomachus Flavianus, consul, vicarius of Africa and prefect of Italy, had dedicated himself to divination, and later on, out of discomfort, he would kill himself. There was all the example of Socrates, of Stoicism, etc., but even there, why don't you fight? And divination was something the Romans abhorred originally, because it was, yes, the Auspex existed, but it was a component, mostly of Etruscan origin, in fact, of the Chthonic side, existing next to the Apollonian Roman religion, the heavenly Roman religion, that the Romans had always maintained a very kind of fear and respect towards, because they were aware of the power of the Chthonic forces. That's the evil. That's how serious they took the power of the darkness in order to fight against it, and still knowing that Chthonic element, it was also more successful among the masses of the lunar Etruscan religion and the plebeian element, were necessary were to be listened, right? Not to determine anything. So divination instead at this point had been introduced firmly and fully in the entire ritual, and so you're basically somebody who does things on the base of, I don't know, on the movement of the stars, or looking at the bowels of animals, or the flight of birds, instead, say, of doing something even in spite of that, like Caesar, that goes against everything just by trusting Fortuna, so that he would become a star instead of following it to tell the star what to do. This is the reversal, right, that's where it becomes a superstition, right? Ancient peoples didn't look at the stars because they simply thought that stars determined their own life. Stars did not determine a hero's life, right? It determined, again, an average no one's life, because they had decided they were weak enough not to act, right? So a hero was a star, because it would become after death. So again, think how also modernistic and secularistic this attitude had become after centuries of history, which is a lot of time, and where the majority of the people is Chthonic masses at the end of the day. So also the elite maybe can feel like, okay, we're so rich, we can do whatever we want, why should we even care about being fully invested in, I don't know, in having a concrete power, being great generals, taking over. This is the dimming of the awareness of the sacred. Flavianus' son, some years after the death of his father, will convert to Christianity, which would allow him to preserve his family assets, also the favor of Theodosius in the process. And maybe that was even a more clever choice, to reflect through Christian precepts on the kind of trauma that had been witnessed at that point. Next to these important names, we also find the ones of modest functionaries, members of the army, and priests that had enclosed themselves, say, within the Roman Senate as an institution to save as much as they could the assets inherited and the same tradition, right? And thus showing how paganism at that point, at least in that phase, meant sometimes the will of preserving and defending privileges that could not be maintained anymore, right? It's the same thing with modernity and the end of empires and monarchies and so on. Why did this happen in the 17th and the 18th century? We blame the people, rightfully, because of course these were devoid of individual value and they ruined culture. But the question is, what kind of elite would let the people take over if it had not weakened, right? This is a very actual topic nowadays, because we see institutions kind of dying because, and hardly, say, the easy explanation of any materialist, of any nationalist or socialist is that, I don't know, it's the institution that is wrong. for a reason or another. This situation is not wrong. It's people were not fit anymore. There's another point entirely. And this gradual decline can be easily observed by just the kind of lifestyle these people had. I mean, people used to fight on all their life long, like literally getting to the hardcore political military dialectic. So having necessarily also to have a very specific connection with the people. And that's where Rome had pioneered the whole thing, because it had extended the Imperium even to those plebeians who would prove to be strong enough. So not denying reality for what it happens, but giving that possibility of prospect, of a potential, of a better force could be spread. At this point, this thing did not exist anymore. Yes, everybody was a Roman citizen. Everybody had become a Roman subject, factually, because the process of Romanization did bring to the improvement, the creation of a middle class, etc. But these people had softened up and gentrified too much and given ground to the senatorial luxus that had taken over and that had no intention to give back again. And so, again, always the reason is because the people let it happen. But at the same time, when you look at the expansion of the Roman Empire, all the greatest conquests, etc., were done against the senatorial luxus. Were done by emperors to give more space to a robust middle class that would make the backbone of the empire. This is true for basically all civilizations. So we are in a very different condition. This has nothing to do with paganism or Christianity. This has to do, again, within the broader frame of universal religion, what kind of standards you have to maintain and with which depth and sophistication. These people were brutal. Like Symmachus, for example, I don't know, he sent, as we'll see, he will use a very formal letter to answer St. Ambrose, speaking of tolerance towards paganism. Say, we should all live peacefully and together. This man ordered a vessel virgin to be buried alive for not having been fit to the role. This is the same man who complained that the crocodiles, the lions, and other wild animals that had been brought for the game in Rome were sick or something, so they were lame in the spectacle, and also that some Saxon gladiators had been hired to kill each other in the Colosseum, preferred to strangle each other rather than fighting, to put an end to their miseries, at least in the way they decided autonomous. So we're talking about a display of power that objectively Christianity was criticizing, if anything, even in the concept that there was such a big divide between the elite standards and even the lowest elements. Right? Christianity was advocating for the equality in potential of everyone. So not saying that everybody was equal, because nobody is, right? But that we can all be more. We can, in theory, all be saved. So what we're telling any person that they had never heard of, because slaves were not even considered human beings factually, is that possibility of transfiguration was in theory open to anyone through salvation, through Christ. No, they weren't promising it to them. They were telling them that the harder you struggled, and the more it was likely for you to achieve that. Right? If you don't understand that this is the same doctrine of struggle and victory that was believed before, that brought to the same civilization to be born, including the Roman one, and its truer, deeper meaning, well, you can see why Christianity triumphed. The potential, the awakening that such promise entails provides with any person with the need of reflecting on that possibility and on the potential you can assume that is infinite, is absolute, is total in salvation. Because it's not, as most people believe today, heaven is like you go to a place on the clouds with other people and just stay there. It sounds even pretty boring, telling you the truth. It's something that goes far beyond. It's reaching beyond yourself. It's the absolute. It's reaching a heavenly status itself. In what you are meant to be as a human to the fullest. And the reason why works are so important is that, again, contrarily to the anti-clerical, anti-religious stereotype, it's not that you have to be to work like a slave all your life just to eventually die and it's all a scam, nothing happened. Because you actually improve your life by struggling in it. Because you cannot achieve anything without struggle. Nothing. Even if people give you everything you may want to have, you will, if you don't have the moral capacity to know what it means to have earned it, you don't know what to do with that. So that's also why it's not about, it can't be a materialistic view, and it's somewhat odd that materialism is criticized today by people who are communists. That is to say, the entire communist doctrine is purely materialistic, and what you are complaining about is about current materialism. Maybe you should look at universal tradition and realizing what true anti-materialism really is. But no, of course, to pretend that humanity exists for a communist is a very difficult concept, so we will leave it there. And so any form of logic or even coherence or intelligence of any kind. So when we look at these various characters that appear, more than convinced of the goodness of paganism, and they are also legitimately worried about the somewhat revolutionary instances that exist politically, socially, morally, connected to the preaching of the gospel. Well, we see there that he who has something that has not deserved doesn't have the power to defend it even. Because somebody who would have earned his own prerogatives would die for them, for property, for family, for God, because it's all one. And that's when the spiritual and the bodily are sealed together indestructibly in our life, because only let's say, and in fact, the idea of being resurrected together with the body is not even an anti-traditional way, right? We're not Gnostics. Even in universal tradition, people essentially transfigured to a state where, say, both our conscience and our physicality, of course, transcend to a dimension that we don't understand, but it's not an anti-physicality or anti-material material goods or anything. Right? You can enjoy goods exactly because God wants you to, without being a materialist at the same time, because you know the worth of it. So this step, this double tread, evidently, at some levels, does not exist. Thus we have the most unregulated elite that eventually fall, because they are really exploitative and do not really know how to handle the situation, because otherwise, again, you would die for it. And instead, most of these processes are smoother. And they speak for the fact that people don't care about the truth and don't care about defending it with their own lives. And also, they don't see the advantages that occur in having people empowered, right, individually, to have a stronger world. That's why, for example, the Germanic peoples took over politically and militarily. Eventually were absorbed from a social point of view, again, for, if anything, for those economical and demographic reasons. But these were much simpler, tribal, primitive realities that, however, were so much under so much pressure, right, that had the cohesion to make the difference and to be the next model that the average person wanted to pursue. The colonists that worked in this nobility latifundia as Romans became Germans because they knew that the importance given to liberty in that community was much more highly preserved. Not just individually, of course, most of them would have thought mostly so, but making them reflect on what they could do with that liberty and realizing that it was about being more compact still, because especially the world of the time was still very much challenged. I mean, the Byzantines would keep challenging these, and the same Italian theater is very, 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 very meaningful because it was where the same Romans were, the true Romans. If we are to look at those who made the empire, if we had the Imperium, and that decided, for example, it was better to be an Ostrogoth or a Longobards on the long run than whatever Constantinople decided. And remember there, Constantinople didn't have the spiritual voice of the church really challenging the emperor, because it was under the emperor. In the West, these people still had the papacy that had a much different attitude towards secular authority, as also the same St. Ambrose examples now will show, right? And without that challenge, you can't keep your morality alive. One of the reasons why, this broader line failed, right? This kind of, attachment to the old is thus, of course, moral, and it can be read in the epistles, in the letters, in the dialogue, in fact, between St. Ambrose and Symmachus. In fact, the pagan literary production is very often kind of very empty, right? Without color, without passion, right? The Stoicism that the Romans bought in, because it was, after all, a resurgence of the same Indo-European ideal in the Hellenistic world that the Romans came to know, having that mentality still very strongly alive, that they liked it very much, has nothing to do with not feeling, right? Stoicism means that you feel some of the strongest powers you can ever imagine within yourself and knowing how to tame them. What you read in these letters instead, is very weak points, talking about respect, tradition, just because it's an old institution. What about its meaning? What about what we just said up to this point? Where did you forget about that? This is terrifying, right? If an Augustus had read such letters, would have said, what have these people become in the first place? It's very much connected to commonplaces, socioeconomical prejudices, so not moral, spiritual, political, military ones. No, it's just, look at, don't take us away, public, finance of our institutions. They're connected to those rights because, we can't be the ruling class anymore, right? And they would have still been, because as we've seen, they converted to Christianity anyhow, and they became the next ruling class anyway. And also a pretty good one, because they still were aware partly of that. It's just that they cared very much about their power, too. So it's also kind of understandable why they behaved like that. Like, I don't know historically any other people or country that didn't actually display these things, because it's pretty much universal. So these were familiar clans that had been once very powerful in actual fact. They had controlled chunks of the empire. Now they hardly could, because the empire had been militarized, taken over in part by the same provincial, local governors and armies, etc. They were very much interconnected. The Roman Senate was very much in contact, especially with the Gallic one. There were lots of people coming from the various provinces in the Western Senate as well. But the point is that now their bases of power were being shattered, because the bases of power were starting to speak properly of internal strife, of military power, and most of these peoples had lost control on the very resources they could put together, right? Especially here, the problem of the gods is looming. There are many issues that eventually the same East will get rid of by sending them to the West, that kind of compromised eventually with these peoples, and also, as we've seen in our Latin Germanic Europe playlist, kind of, more successfully led to a civilizational revival. But at the moment, those very elites were weakening. The eastern part of the empire had been rebuilt in a more autocratic way that temporarily was more successful, but as we know, would also be put in difficulty by the West in some century after all. This is just 400 years from Charlemagne, right? So not an extremely long time, considering that in theory there is still a united Roman Empire. Still at this point, there is paganism, right? So finally, and enlightening, the episode connected to the altar of victory is connected. This was famously enough a statue of Hellenic making that had reached Rome at the time of the Tarentine Wars, and it had been placed by Augustus after the Battle of Actium, quite meaningfully, in the Curia Julia, among the tutelar numina of the state, so much that the senators, when they entered the Senate, used to burn a little grain of incense as a sacrifice to victory all the time. So this already speaks of the kind of monarchic system that Augustus had established, the entire reconstruction of the empire, the reestablishment of the Golden Age, this system that had lasted up for 300 years remarkably well, considering that Rome was also quite, it was not really a state in the way we intended at the time, right? It was actually becoming just in the 4th century something more similar, bureaucratically and in terms of centralization. So before, it had been really a much greater matter of moral forces. Like the Romans emerged from their kind of barbarian, kind of tribal Italic background very quickly, very fast. They had a very non-secularized and modernized mindset, and that's what in great part also allowed them to achieve what they achieved. And the statue of victory naturally was the broader symbol of the Imperium, because victory flies from Jupiter to the Imperator, as a matter of fact, and she would be the same guardian angel, that is to say, the guy's soul transfigured divinely already, and therefore having established this connection with the divinity electively. And what kind of greater accomplishment was to repristinate not just the Golden Age, but through the recomposition of the chosen people's unity after the end of the civil wars. So this was more than a victory or victory. This is the point that I'm talking about polytheism. You would think it would be a deity called victory in an absolute sense, but it is the victory, like in the sense of this personal soul's transfiguration, not a hypostasized kind of let's say standardized victory, and that you could simply define as such. The Romans had never such thought. This was we think like it also because of the Greeks, because we're very much the children of their thinking that had categorized. They stopped thinking in terms of like a Persian would do, like, I don't know, what kind of tree is this? It's like it is this specific tree. The Greeks began to to think of what kind of different trees could be categories, different trees could be put together because of their similarity. The Romans didn't reason like that. The Romans still thought that every single person was unique and different. And they all accomplished different things on the base of their greatness. And they took it extremely seriously. So that victory was Augustus' victory. And the point is that since all the other emperors would be called Augusti, they would have to be up to the standards of Augustus. What kind of Augustan standard was there in an empire that was ruled now by a religious current that was denying it that value and forcing this very world rulers, or at least those who embodied some of the greatest parts of the Imperium, because the various offices that we have listed had the Imperium, right? Some magistracies, like the consulate, etc., as you know, had the Imperium, so it was part of the Imperator was the medium, you see, and that's also where the redemption, the Evangelion, in the idea of a single guy that actually achieves that immortal transfiguration through self-sacrifice had already been in the air. It had been Augustus. It had been Caesar also. And that's why these names echoed. And that's why we talk about Rome. And that's still why we have been talking about at least titles like Kaiser, Tsar, etc. Because there was nothing else but Rome in the history of mankind. And no other possible one. So the same Christians eventually would take this. The same Germans would take it's paradoxical, right? Romans wanted to become Germans in a political, institutional, cultural way, but the imperium of the Germans was Roman, and there was no German power who was not called Roman Empire ever existing as an empire. Right? Reflect on that. So this is immense. That's how big that legacy was. And it's odd that as Westerners we don't remember this today. We just think that Rome was yet another faction to play in a video game that you can also kind of have strange opinions on. There's no such thing, because the truth exists. And so you cannot afford to have really an opinion. That's why everything has a sense. And every action, every accomplishment speaks of that sense. It's not an accident. It's not something you're determined by randomly. And if so, it's because you're weak not to realize it. That's what these people believed in traditional, universal tradition. When going finally to the latter, when Emperor Constantius II, on the occasion of his visit to Rome in 357, ordered to remove the altar to Victoria that had been historically erected there, the statue had been immediately reintegrated with the advent of Julianus. However, Gratian, with the Imperial decree of 382, ordered the definitive removal of the statue, and with the same dispositio abolished the qualification also of Pontifex Maximus for the emperor. So the older cult was changed, right? It means that there was no such thing like the previous pagan religion of state anymore, right? The emperor was there, was still the same meaning, right? So it's not that religion actually changed. As we were saying before, there's no such thing like a universal religion possibly changing. It's always the same. But it's not anymore in that right and in that institution. The emperor also suppresses different indemnities that were granted, this is the point, to pagan priests and to the Vestal virgins. And this was a huge deal, by the way, because that is a bit less, this all, it is painful, because the sacred fire is in part preserved by the church, but specifically the Vestal one, is the same fire of the Veda, of the old Indo-European religion, is extinguished. Is an extremely painful thing, and you cannot but wanting to cry thinking about that. But the idea that that's also a human fire, right? It's a symbol of something greater that lives, that is life itself, that lives in the same stars, in the same force of heaven, in the same God, right? And that can never be extinguished, as the Gospel says, right? So think about that. So the substance of the debate is that was fueled also among pagans and Christians, is financial in part, because those people were ousted properly of their functions, were paid also a lot by the state. And this Symmachus, I say it because Symmachus, who was defending the pagans, points this out, and I can say not very intelligently. I mean, obviously he was seeking to repristinate that with that letter, but you're actually defending your universal tradition, and what you babble about is that you haven't received money. Like, it's a big deal. You should be defending your values because of the truth. If you really believe in that, and the truth is that you're losing. So how do you explain that? The entire religion you believe in is based on struggle and victory, and you're losing. How do you explain that? It's your fault. The entire tradition says that every time you lose or whatever happens to you, it's because you are faulty. You, not others. You, because it doesn't matter what others do. If you truly have guts, you die, right, to defend the truth. And in fact, he says that these various noble senators had been offended, right, and they had complained using religious points, but actually also presenting very concrete requests to the emperor, by the way, to preserve the appanages that were evidently what they cared very much about, and that now were considered illegitimate and somewhat out of time, at least from a Christian perspective. In order to resolve the problem was thus taken the decision to send some ambassadors in Milan, that is the see where the emperor resided at the time, and the sovereign wouldn't receive the Roman ambassadors because he considered the senatorial decision to make this request to him, considered that he had been the same ruler who had abolished what these people wanted to be repristinated. And also considering that formally, also good part of the Senate of Rome is Christian, right? So there were Christians within the Senate that had been also, well, some probably, like the thing that didn't count for them anymore because usually they couldn't receive the money, couldn't perform the rituals, but probably they had been in part obliged, but in part also probably sharing some benefits from those who had received these appanages once again, so that all the Senate spoke, including the Christian element. Naturally, we don't have to be so weak-minded. We can think that the same Christians understood the relevance of the Statue of Victory and many other things in a kind of romantic but sound sense. I mean, it's the same thing like it's a symbol, it's how you love the place. It's like in today's Rome as well, that there is the Statue of Victory on the Capitol, which is of course also a consequence of the fact of when the Kingdom of Italy took over control in Rome, and kind of isolated the papacy, and so repristinated kind of against that kind of Christian older issue of the Statue of Victory at the time of St. Ambrose and Symmachus, the symbol of victory, right? So that's just a simple. But you don't want that pagan, like even if you don't care anything about paganism or Christianity, you don't want to see St. Peter's removed or the symbol of victory removed, right? You can have different ideas, but a part of you will say this is a tradition, right? And surely this point, which is, a pretty sensible one, was felt. The point is that Christians were intransigent, they were intolerant, but they were because they believed in the absolute value of what they were defending. And in that sense, that intransigence was the same one that the Romans had against other cults, that contrarily also was what your liberal teachers have unfortunately taught you, had absolutely a list of illicit cults that were banned and destroyed and razed, and not just because of, because especially sorcery, this kind of things that were connected to the chthonic element of the story. Some will say the Druids. Well, in the Druids, there were a very strong female element. We were talking about it in the videos about Celtic warfare recently, and there was an important chthonic Dionysian substratum there. There was also, incidentally, anti-Imperial, and so anti-Apollonian as well. Yes, the Roman crushed that, but do you see a problem in that? Like, don't you crush terrorists? Right? I don't know what's your point. Say, well, but the Romans invaded their country. Well, those peoples still believed the same concept because they were also Apollonian by a large. The Druidic, even within Druidism, the chthonic aspects were relatively minority. But those Gauls, believe the same concept, right? He who is stronger has the right to rule. Well, the Romans kicked their ass. So who did have the right to rule then? Right? You have to go by your standards. Incidentally, Christianity was adding something a bit more humane in it, and was still a concept because humanitas was a thing in the Latin set of virtues as well, and also there was surely an equivalent in the Celtic world or Germanic world, whatever. But was saying, okay, let's work to something more cohesive, to something more less detrimental in the first place, and let's at least be up to certain standards. So the senatorial request of give us back our indemnities, because instead then thinking about the value of the same symbols is kind of weird, right? And we'll see it now because it's literally the content of Symmachus' letters, which again you would think this is the hero that, again, the terrible obscurantism of Christianity that have told you that occurred historically was talking about the true values and virtues. If you read the letters, you say, what the hell is this guy talking about? Doesn't say anything about the actual values of the old tradition. Anything. But whatever. Not even continuistically. So that Symmachus was not stupid, by the way. So it makes me suspect that, of course, there was a general... he was talking to Christian emperors. So it's not that you could just fool around and being so propagandistic and openly intransigent against the guy that can't come and take you out. So that's maybe an explanation. But again, what kind of heroic standard is that if you truly believe in your values as well, right? Aren't you stronger? Isn't Christianity just a prava superstitio? Why would you be scared of that? A hero would never be, because he will just take any action without fear, which is the true meaning of the Apollonian, Uranian, heavenly religion. So 2 years after this first embassy, the question had a new stage, because Emperor Gratian died tragically, and of his departure, the pagans see the realization of the gods' wrath, right, and revenge for his propension towards Christianity. It's true that 4th century emperors had been quite ambiguous, by the way, regarding Christianity and paganism, and also because they had an empire to rule on, so they couldn't really be so very, just idealistic or abstract about concrete power. So at that point, the young Valentinian II rises to the throne. He's less close to paganism. because his mother is Arian, and his first minister was a Frank, by the way. Bauto has not even converted to Christianity, right? So that was the kind of Arian pagan faction versus the Orthodox Christian one, or and the Catholic Christian one. It's put it better, though it's properly the Orthodoxy that is stressed against Arianism. And profiting of this young emperor, the Roman senators come back with their proposal. They sent a new embassy, about which we are informed exactly because of the letter, the famous letter of St. Ambrose, that was very much worried about the consequences that the reintegration of Statue of Victory as a political symbol. It was a struggle of power, let's remember. So it was not even it, right? But all the problems it could bring, and the fact that these factions hated each other, of course. So the great Milanese bishop will manage to get the relatio attached by Symmachus by asking the emperor as a bishop to his faithful, not as as an administrator to his superior, because he was just a Roman magistrate that the emperor had wanted there because was his supporter. But as soon as he becomes bishop, he takes his role extremely seriously and extremely intelligently, by the way. And so that he was informed about what the Roman Senate wrote, and he would add to it a counter relation transmitted to Valentinian, who will at that point manifest himself completely favorable to the Christians, thus closing this yearly matter with the distance and the definitive removal of the simulacrum of victory. So the episode is ambiguous, as we've seen, because to defend the Christian conquests are not Roman Catholics but the Bishop of Milan that wouldn't have to be invested of affairs of external to his own diocese, and so as a bishop, right, but as a magistrate, as a politician, he knew perfectly well the weight of Milan already at the time, etc. And yet, not really having those juridical reasons that would justify his intervention. But this is at the same time the power that the church already had, and the prestige, the moral posture, properly, and the force was being recognized already in the West, in this great seas, right? When we pick about Rome, Ravenna, Milan, the Gallic Church, right? The connection between this diocese, these churches, is enormous, right? For the history of the West, this axis, especially in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, was really the axis of Western Europe as a whole, right? And it is immense. That's why Christian history, by the way, is so important, because, again, how many people care? Let's be honest. I see it, as always, in my videos, stats, that people care about ethno-nationalism. Essentially nothing else. If you don't know these steps of history, you can't go anywhere. This is the sap of what true European actually means. Culturally, historically, identitally, and it cannot be, it's not a personal opinion. The entire Westernness revolves on this, or at least used to revolve on it, right? And it's not that there's been a substitution, it's been simply people forgot. They didn't add anything more or new. They restricted, shrank, right? And there's been an important story also behind this, because Pope Damasus surely had an influence on St. Ambrose. So also Rome had influenced Milan, of course, in the process. Surely some Christian senator in Rome that knows the influence exercised by Ambrose on Valentinian will bring to this overstepping, say, of the traditional boundaries, just of even within the same church of the empire. It's also definitely just the character, the moral stature, the higher preparation of the bishop, and also probably the writing qualities of Saint Ambrose. And through the help of the great Milanese bishop, the cause of the Christians will triumph, and Ambrose will send a long, meticulous response to Symmachus, with which he debunks one by one I wouldn't say the pagan arguments, but that weren't expressed, right? Even assuming that paganism existed, which, as we've seen, or Christianity, they were speaking about the same things. That's why Ambrose points at the value of ancient pagans and says, those great Roman heroes made the thing, right? And even if they didn't know the incarnated verb, there is something within humanity that makes the difference between good and evil, right? There was not just evil before Christ at all. So it's rather he debunks Symmachus' arguments, underlying that, of course, first of all, Christian religion is the only true one, the sole one that acquired the support in practice. You can even say the Imperium by a certain degree, political, civil life. So it's destined to have also an official recognition and exiting from this perennial state of inferiority, which it had been maintained before, even after Constantine, by a degree. And he laments, among the other things, I'm also making a synthesis because the most poignant aspects are ones in part I already highlighted, but it's, for example, is the safety of the empire connected to maintenance of the older practices? Because this is what, again, most people believe. If you do those specific rites, things will go well, right? This is just like very current, contemporary ideas, mindset. Enormous problems. Just do a sacrifice, problems will disappear. I mean, seriously. And also, in this sense, attacking the Christians that were instead earning their place in the empire, and in spite of severe repercussions that also pagan culture would have, etc. Most of the process of Christianization was gradual, spontaneous, and kind of still definitely intertwined with lots of paganism that continued happening very, very easily, right? For a long time, just to confirm what we were saying before, that, and in fact, Ambrose is quite clear in the letter. He doesn't advocate for the elimination of paganism. He just says the state shouldn't pay it. It shouldn't, essentially have it as the official cult anymore, right? Because it was also about the cult and the aforementioned concept that we were saying. Why should we have the cult of an emperor, for example? Because the church was separated from the state, right? Again, as the liberal teachers unfortunately told you, we didn't separate state and church since Westphalia or later. As long as the church existed, if you have even read the Gospels and studied history, the investiture struggle or other things, just to mention a little, was always separated from the state. Always. Right? And, not knowing this means that you literally don't know the difference between temporal and spiritual. And how can you understand anything historical from that standpoint is, frankly, a great mystery. And Ambrose's answer to the Roman senators is important because the future saint doesn't deny, in fact, the liberty of the other religions and cults. It doesn't proposes persecutory solutions against those who believe in a different way from the Christians, interestingly enough, which is also actually what Symmachus writes. He says, there are different ways to the same end, right? To the same great end, the absolute one, the universal one. But give us our money back. Just respect this old tradition because it's old. It literally says this. That's the main point. We don't know because these were other answers. There was another letter that we don't know, but Ambrose replicates so that we know more or less what he said in the other one too. What seems unacceptable to Ambrose is that the pagans, besides celebrating the sacrifices on an altar, pretend the presence of the Christians to the right. That's yet another very interesting point, that it has to do with lay culture still today, which was developed in Christendom exactly because of the separation between state and church. Actually, in Roman times, there was no such thing. State and church were the same. That's the same reason why Christians were persecuted. Because the idea is that you had to agree with the wall, and if only one person in a community was against, it broke the perfection of the community, and so the gods would take revenge on that. It was just not dealing with heroes, but dealing with somebody fallen, right, in the divine community relation. That's a very deep point, and that's the reason why this is true in any paganism. This was not just Rome. This is also, I don't know if you ever studied the Icelandic. There are so many Norse elements where you say there were priests who checked what people did. You could not say start colonizing another place without the permission of the community. You had to do what the rite said, and this was based mostly on divination. So as we were saying, most of the times actually a chthonic dimension. So to practices that people began to say, but are these any worthy? Of course they were kind of controlled by the priests politically together with the authority, also for the outcome of the same. But let's say it's a deterministic way. It's actually a chthonic thing. You're teaching people to obey passively without having a conscience saying no. This is the meaning of martyrdom. This is the meaning of also behind the Christian persecution. As you know, the Romans were not particularly cruel. Persecutions were heterogeneous. They were very politically ad hoc. There was, generally speaking, a great problem in carrying out, killing somebody. It took a long time, also juridically speaking, because the person was asked, was trying to be convinced, they were going soft with it, right? That's also the point why this same religion, you can see perspectively, failed at a point, because before they would have just, killed you immediately, in a sense, right? So knowing this little bit of things is crucial. You see, freedom of conscience was connected to heroes, just like Caesar was saying before in the Roman, in the attached religion, was about saying, I will come out of the same boundaries of the res publica. The same concept of the Pontifex Maximus at least embodied that. Say not exactly with this thing of Caesar and the Fortuna that I made I made a video on, but let's say the idea that the hero steps beyond the same human boundaries, and so he's free to go against whatever humanity has decided, right? Christians did the same thing. They said, why should I sacrifice to the emperor? Many would do that. There are some bishops who also said, if the alternative is being killed, okay, you can do it if you don't believe it, but it's not best, right? So martyrs, and also Christian geography naturally exaggerated in a sense the magnitude of martyrs. So this is true. There were also Christian persecution of pagans by other degrees, but also these have been relatively exaggerated because what we have been told, essentially, this was a massive clash of culture, civilization, worldview. It really never happened. As we're saying, they religiously spoke the same language. They recognized the same values. I mean, what was happening here, by the way, you see even as people, so it was happening between Rome and Milan. Like Syria and Egypt, yes, would have different ideas, right? Even, I don't know, Ireland had different ideas at this point. Think about Pelagianism. Some of these ideas were in common. Most of these ideas, I just said, of the universality of the empire, but what I mean is that most of these struggles were, of course, of political nature, right? It's like, why did the Byzantine emperors compromise with monophysitism and monothelitism? Well, they had to save the granaries of Egypt, of Palestine, of Syria, that wanted to rebel because they were decentralized and they didn't want to pay taxes to Constantinople. Right, so of course this informed the same worldview on religion and on those specific heresies, etc. But we're talking about kins. We're not talking about strange, different people, right? In fact, there is a lot of racism attached to these views, as if, again, the aforementioned thing that this was a Semitic cult began to pollute the true Indo-European vows. They were the same people, right? It is true that it's about a moral race, but not, in fact, a biological race. And that's a delusion. But even within that same moral race status, we're talking about heterogeneous people, normal, and just also extraordinary ones who made the difference, and St. Ambrose won the struggle. For example, he writes, Symmachus wants that, the altars to the god and the ornaments to the old temples to be reinstituted to him, but this is pretended by those that share that superstition, and not by Valentinian II, that has learned how to honor only the altar of Christ, and which would serve to oblige the pious and the pious hands and the lips of the faithful to the action such as sacrilegious act, right? Why obliging the Christians to take part in it? Given that, by the way, they couldn't condemn them anymore because persecutions were over in that regard. Only the name of Christ will have to resonate in the voice of Valentinian, that is a Christian, from the moment that the pagans from their side have never dreamt to revere Christ. This is so kind of just an example, a rhetorical example, but it continues. It says, "We Christians, we are grown amidst the offenses, the martyrs. We have known the persecutions as outlaws, while the pagans today pretend that their religious manifestations have to be even paid by the state, while we are pride of martyrdom. They look to their interests and to the economical damage. We thus believe, to be a victory what they believe, that they consider to be an offense." And that's the point of sacrifice. That is to say, we struggled to the top, and we even reached it. What did they do? Like, even if their beliefs had been better, they didn't convince. So through their own standards of struggle and victory, if they were to be the heroes in the process, they failed anyway. Because as we've seen, only the victors have the right to rule. So why aren't they victorious now? And I think about money. At least we were persecuted at a point. We struggled our way through. Naturally, we don't have the Symmachus text, which Ambrose is responding. And there is a value in this wolf story, however, because Theodosius had to step in at a point. He will be invested in even the usurper Eugenius, that was philo-pagan and more condescending towards the senators, will promise to take care of it, but he will not commit himself too much not to be enemy of the Christians. And that's quite interesting, because it shows that, again, there was that power within the same Roman nobility at that point, right? And in case you didn't notice, there was no socio-economical revolution at the end of the day. Even with the advent of Christianity, actually, the elite remained there where it was. So even on this occasion, that is a pretty turbulent one politically, we could digress to explain the context, but it's a bit complicated. In any case, Ambrose protested again, and he will not consent in any way to the Curia Julia being profanated by the pagan cult. This is also interesting because Ambrose, again, was a politician. He was a magistrate himself, knew how politics worked, and he cared about the Curia Julia being Christian. So it's not that he hated the memory of the Julii or of the empire. Just this was another way of viewing the same religion from another standpoint, and to the renewal of the same, and with greater strength than this elite had showed, or some, those who were converting were showing. Either were it only because of convenience, but also because of actual belief. And surely they believed also as senators much of the same later on, right? They were very educated also in the as Christians in the older religion for a long time. This was true also in the much more Christian East, by a lesser degree in terms of actual level of education of the elite, but still, right, was there. They studied the Odyssey, the Iliad. Regarding Eugenius, this was an usurper, by the way. He was brought to the imperial throne in 392 by the general Arbogast, who had killed Valentinian II. Right, so pretty harsh times, by the way. And this character, as we have seen, is friend of the pagans, but he will grant the reopening of the temples. He will render some of the old appanages to the priests. Interestingly enough, the same Symmachus in his letter had said something like, "Who can be so friend of the Christian, so friend of the barbarians to support Christianity?" Well, the senatorial faction was supported by many barbarians, as a matter of fact. So it was something, unclear about this position. In theory, in practice, it was evident why. And the idea yet was, again, that the same one that Christianity embraces, and that the same old Romans had embraced, as to make Romans many other peoples. So much that France or Spain were not Romano-Italic realities, speak Romance today, and beyond Latin impact, because that was the success of Rome, is the Evangelion, again, of giving everyone the possibility of proving their value, and if so, being rewarded for it. It was the same idea that the Christians were pushing today. There was no such thing like there were barbarians that were seen as the forces of evil, but they were seen within man. And that's where the dimming of the twilight of the gods, in that sense, was understood internally, right? Whereas the old senatorial elite saw it by a certain degree, at least they felt the need of defending, maybe only that, in the mayor ritual, in the mere advantages that derive from it, not by the action, not by the conscience. This is the enormity of the Christian tide, and the reason why it prevailed. Exactly at that point, in the urbs, the prefect, Symmachus Flavianus, had temporarily, so with the barbarian, also this kind of under Eugenius and his general Arbogastes, had some church closed. So that tells you also in Rome how complex the situation was. You couldn't take such a radical stand. So giving some position of power back to some trusted elements of pagan faith. However, the anti-Christian kind of phase will be shorter and even less important than the one of Julianus. And so the final victory of Theodosius on Arbogastes, by the way, at the Frigidus River, will dissolve paganism forever, as the Roman Empire would fully become Christian. European civilization essentially spread from these areas to the rest of the continent, and it was never like a reversal of the trend anymore. Also for the dramatic convenience that we have explained, not just in this video, but in the many others about early medieval Europe, for that matter. But the victory on the Frigidus River is crucial, because even there it was an actual military attempt to reassert that Western, still kind of pagan, revitalizing attempt to power, to crush the also Orthodox Christian view of Theodosius, and also the East, right? So this proving the West had still its own to say, but the victory in battle, that is what defines the Imperator, goes to Theodosius, to the Christian emperor. And interestingly enough, before the battle, the site of Arbogastes had placed on the peaks of the Julian Alps golden statues of Jupiter to stop the advance of the Christian Theodosius. That's the vain simulacrum, right? A Caesar or a Scipio would have never placed like a statue just up there to say, okay, let's hope this will make us win. Jupiter, that is the one that gave victory to Theodosius. Do you think he cared about those statues? This is a very relevant point, because as we were saying again, this was a fight over symbols rather than the greatness of God. Or at least from one side was still the idea that one symbol could stop history, could prevent history from changing or requiring new challenges and adaptations and responses and fights and struggles and victories, right? And that everything had to remain like it was for some strange reason that you could even think would be your own personal perfection, but that if you believe so, this is denied by the same fact that you're not perfect enough not to make things change, which we all know something about, I would say. Even the pronostics drawn from the archaic practice of the Aruspicina, so those Etruscan origin divination things that were Chthonic but had been integrated by Defoe as this occult science, to say, whatever I will read in these bowels will mean it is. Well, it would be pretty convenient, right? You just sorted out the future, right? Good for you. You will always do the right thing. Instead, no. the Roman hero fights and wins because of his own power and action, because he changes the world and changes the universe forever, right? I would say to his own image, right? And if you're able to do it, at least this can happen by a minimal part, right? It's just like saying, in the history of the church, the value that a Saint Peter had, a Saint Paul had, they are much closer to each other than to God, incommensurably, right? So to show that that perfection, in a way, is a myth. If you believe in tradition, if you're humble enough to realize that, yes, you have to try always your best and to go beyond any possible limit, but you also have to realize that you are limited. So if you want to accomplish anything, you can't work without these two concepts. It may seem an oppositional thought, and it's counterintuitive, because all of this is counterintuitive. All reality is counterintuitive, at least for the way we have been taught intuition. But it's really not, because intuitively we know when things go wrong if we go without this preparation. And nature never lies. When we observe this aspect, we realize instead that whatever was the difference that what we call improperly paganism made, at least those people that made the Roman Empire, taking over the world, accomplished for sure, that quality had ended in the consciences before than in public and private life by the 4th century. The world aged. All the efforts of the last members of a ruling class that was overwhelmed by the events failed, and thus the Church of Christ opened to a new road of important, irreversible conquests that show, in a sense, another age of heroes that, however, again, in the broader history of mankind, brings to decline. Because the decline, again, is not is also collective, right? This is important in the traditional history, in the Christian history as well, pagan, Christian alike, that the dimming of the awareness of the sacred in somebody's heart affects everyone, because we are all intertwined. We all command one another. We all have an influence in the world, and so everything matters collectively. And that's why the collectivity was so important. Why some standards, if uniform, had to stick to a credibility, sticking to some kind of random dice rolling, as other cultures did too. I mean, Tacitus describes therefore the Germans, to look at stakes forms, how they threw them, like other issues. It was random because they needed to take decisions fast without too much political division within. With a civilization, you need something much bigger, something that looks much more critically within the human soul, to acknowledge something that at that stage of civilizational development requires a much bigger community effort, which is not intuitive, like the one of a tribe put under stress by the threat of annihilation. And that is almost instinctive in the way it reacts, right? When you have to rule the world entire, you need something greater. That's also why the same paganism, in a sense, had gone towards a direction that was able to integrate Christianity. Because enotheism, after all, was that. So what we change there is, as always, what we see there compares not the type of the form per se, but it's the strength that you put in it. It's how much you believe, right? But the idea of how to make a civilization work is pretty much universal in its own kind. As much as it's universal, the decline that occurs when people are not kept up by something but themselves to maintain the standard. So that is very relevant, I think, and crucial and vital really to understand. And I think that this episode of the Statue of Victory is much better described in these terms than the absolutely shared sadness that I personally own, for example, at the idea how that statue was removed. But that is not, it's much more understandable if you understand the context, which often historically is not done anymore, right? And this is what you have to accept properly if you want to carry out any heroic deed, because lying to yourself, just making things simpler than they are, means to escape your responsibility to interpret the world as it is being given to you, and your potential and what you can do about it all. For today, however, I stop it here. We will keep talking about this late Roman, also religious topics. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.